I have been searching.
Welcome to Following the Fire, a podcast for Christians who are rethinking their faith and need a safe place to doubt. As we wander through the spiritual wilderness, we want to find and follow God wherever the pillar of fire leads.
And just like God's people in the Bible, we get lost, we miss the point, and we don't have all the answers. But maybe that's okay. We're on this journey together. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Steve.
Even on my heart.
All right, everybody, we are excited today. We have a great guest with us today, Carolyn Whitney-Brown, author of Flying, Falling, Catching, which we're going to get to talk to about in a bit. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. So your latest project that we're going to talk about, this book, Flying, Falling, Catching, An Unlikely Story of Finding Freedom. Carolyn Whitney-Brown and co-author is Henri Nouwen. We're going to meet lots of intriguing characters in this book. We get to follow their stories and their arcs. But before we talk about them, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I was brought up in the United Church of Canada, which is Canada's largest Protestant denomination. And then my husband and I met in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So we're an IVCF couple at University of Toronto. And then we went to Brown University in the States to do our PhDs in English Lit. And I did it hardcore. I wrote about Shakespeare. And then we went to England we got some money to go to England and do research at Oxford and Cambridge. So we were kind of running with the fastest and brightest. And in a way, I don't feel like we've ever been really ambitious people, but we were certainly in a world where everybody was very ambitious. And we just started I loved my research. Research delights me. It was so much fun. But I just began to feel uneasy with the kind of people we were becoming. I felt like our sense of normal was just getting smaller and smaller and more elite because we were just spending our time with super bright people. It's sort of what happens if you're immersed in one world. And we also realized we were enjoying our volunteer work with kids from shelters and refugee kids a whole lot more than we were actually enjoying the work we were doing that was setting us up for careers. So we realized we were hungry to learn more about community and prayer and peacemaking. So we spent a year living with 2 intentional communities, Christian communities in England. We did 30-day silent retreats.
Wow.
And that led to an invitation to go to Kenya for 6 months. So we learned a whole lot about community in Africa. And then we moved, in 1990, we moved to L'Arche Daybreak near Toronto. And L'Arche is a network of communities around the world in 37 or 38 countries where people with and without intellectual disabilities assist each other, share their lives, laugh, cry a lot, giggle, are silly, just share their lives together. And so it was at Daybreak that we really got to know Henri Nouwen. And since he's my co-author, shall I introduce Henri too?
I would love to learn
please.
about your friend Henri. Yes.
Yeah, so Henri Nouwen was, I guess, about 25 years older than us. And he lived at Daybreak with us until his sudden death from a heart attack in 1996. That's why I don't have the pleasure of launching this book with Henri, because he's dead. So he was, as you say, a Roman Catholic priest. He was from the Netherlands. He had taught at Yale and Harvard, so like us, he'd come from the Ivy League. And then he came to Daybreak, to this community with people with intellectual disabilities, because he wanted to live a life congruent with the gospel, because he needed a home. And so he lived there for the last 10 years of his life. And in his lifetime, Henri wrote, I think, 39 books. And I think every single one is still in print. They've sold millions of copies. And what really interested him was the spiritual journey, is psychology and spirituality. Not so much religion as such, but how we find God, how we listen to God's call. The adventure of being Christian. Yeah. Or of being spiritual people, really. So in the 1990s, we were living in community with Henri, and we had a lot in common, academic backgrounds and this hunger to expand our horizons to a greater variety of people, with a much more diverse community L'Arche brings in people from all over the world. So it was a time of real spiritual deepening, actually, for Henri himself and for all of us in the community.
How big were the communities that you lived in?
Yeah, ours had, I forget at the time, maybe 10 houses. It was quite big. Some L'Arche communities are small with just one house and a lot of friends, with one house with maybe 5 or 6 people with intellectual disabilities and others living in one home together. Others have a whole lot of houses. In Europe, some of the houses are really big with maybe, 12 bedrooms in them. There's L'Arche in Ukraine, there's L'Arche in Haiti, there's L'Arche in all sorts of places in the world, and L'Arche really is a value of hospitality and care for everyone.
And in the book, and even now, you've been intentional to say that in this community, it's a community of intellectually disabled people and others living together and supporting each other. And at first, it seems like a little bit of a what's the word for this? It seems like, oh, surely it's, I'm used to hearing, oh, it's a community to help disabled people. It's a community for homeless people. It's kind of a one-directional thing, but it becomes very clear, at least in the book, that it really is exactly as you're describing, a community for people who are disabled and not, to live in community and support each other.
Yeah. So it's a community with each other, not for one group. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's neat.
Such an interesting idea.
I could read you a really cool bit from the book. One little bit from the book.
Sure.
Yes, please.
Of what he says about L'Arche. Because he talks about L'Arche and the circus. And it's sort of jumping ahead, but it's so good. Henri said, "Now I live and work with people with mental handicaps, and some also have severe physical handicaps. One of the things that has struck me in my life was that the people with a physical and mental handicap are quite often able to create community. I live in a community with people from 21 different nations. Some people are married, some are single, some people are old, some people are young, some people are Japanese, some Brazilian. Normally these people would never form community, but in the middle there are people with a weak body who often can't speak, who can't express themselves in ideas or big discussion, yet still these people are able to create a community among people who otherwise would never live well together." And then, we'll get on to the trapeze, but this whole book is about his friendship with a trapeze troupe. And he says, when I saw the Flying Rodleighs, this trapeze troupe, I saw in a way the same thing. I saw people who don't speak on the trapeze, who do something with their bodies, and who create community, first of all among themselves as a little group, and among all these people who come to see them, young people, old people, children, people from all different languages. They all understand. They create family wherever they go. They bring people together.
It's such a beautiful. I have that passage underlined because I think that I identified very strongly with Henri in this book. I think I'm not anything like him in most ways, but I feel like the early Henri developed a strong mind without maybe developing a connection to his heart or his body.
Yeah.
And so his surprise was also my surprise, that a group of people with maybe weak minds are excelling at this thing that I'm really bad at, which is living in community, creating. Yeah. Wait a minute. You don't have to, I'm really smart, and this is very difficult for me. I struggle. Yeah. I struggle to make community with my neighbors, and they're also really smart.
Yeah.
What do you think the experience was like for Henri when he arrived and started to discover this truth about these people?
Well, he was very insecure, and he really wanted them to like him. And of course, he couldn't give them books to read or impress them with his credentials. He just had to be himself. And of course, they were ready to like him for himself, but they wanted him to hang around and just waste time together and be there. Yeah. And he wanted to feel like he was accomplishing something. So I think it really took a lot of effort for him to slow down. I would say he never entirely succeeded in that consistently, but really it taught him to slow down and just be there, hang out, waste time, hang around. And one of the really interesting things he started to do was when he would go on speaking trips, whenever he could, he would take members of the community with him. And then, he would he would maybe invite his friend Bill Van Buren to tell his favorite joke, and Bill would get up in front of thousands of people and he'd say, "How do you make holy water?" And the audience would say, "I don't know, Bill." And he'd say, "You boil the hell out of it." And Henry would say,
Whoa.
They're going to forget, the audience is going to forget everything I say, but they're going to remember that Bill and I stood here as friends, as equals together. And they're going to remember that. Yeah.
It's such a good example of showing the story instead of telling the story. And in that same line of thought, there's this idea, I've never thought of it, but where Henry's in this community and he's suddenly having to use his body to convey things instead of his words, and then he relates it to Christ, the Word become flesh. And I love that he's like, I really don't like this. I don't like this thing where it's my body that has to speak. I can't remember exactly, but he had almost a internal rejection of that, even though he was slowly maybe letting go of that part of himself.
Yeah.
So we should skip forward to the exciting part. So there's a circus.
Yeah. I should say something about the book. Shall I jump into that now?
Let's jump into it now.
Open the window to a sky full of clouds. It's been nothing but rain now for what feels like a month.
So we're talking about Henry, and you've written this book, and really the two are very closely related. So can you tell us a little bit about Flying, Falling, Catching?
Yeah. So in 1991, Henry was in Freiburg in Germany, writing a book called Life of the Beloved, which is going to become a book called Life of the Beloved. And he went with his father and his friends to see a traveling circus. And he saw a trapeze troupe called the Flying Rodleighs. And he said, actually, it's okay if I read again? I just love reading Henry's own words since he's not here. He said, "I was not at all prepared for an experience that would deeply influence my future thinking, reading, and writing. The program was quite traditional: horses, tigers, lions, zebras, elephants, and even a giraffe and a rhinoceros. It was all delightful entertainment, but I would have forgotten the evening within a few days and gone back to my writing without any thought about the circus, if there hadn't been the Flying Rodleighs. As the last act before the intermission, 5 trapeze artists, 2 women and 3 men, entered the ring as if they were kings and queens. After having greeted the audience with a movement that made their wide silver capes swirl about them, they removed them, handed them to the attendants, pulled themselves up into the large net, and started to climb the rope ladders that brought them to their positions high up in the tent. From the very moment they appeared, my attention was completely riveted. The self-confident and joyful way that they entered, smiled, greeted the audience, then climbed the trapeze rigging, told me that I was going to see something better, experience something that was going to make this evening unlike any other. The 10 minutes that followed somehow gave me a glimpse of a world that had eluded me so far, a world of discipline and freedom, diversity and harmony, risk and safety, individuality and community, and most of all, flying and catching. I sat transfixed in my chair and I couldn't believe what I saw. So then Henry spent the next 5 years of his life, the rest of his life, planning to write a fantastic book about this experience. He thought it was going to be his best book ever. He was so excited about it. He wanted readers to experience what he experienced. He didn't want to just write about the trapeze. He wanted to write something that would get readers on the inside of the experience. So he thought maybe he could write creative nonfiction or maybe even a novel. So he kept trying to write fragments. He talked and talked and talked about it. And then he died. And he really didn't leave that much of it. There are 2 chapters that are about the first week that he met the Flying Rodleighs. There's a tape where he just babbles with excitement. There's a journal he kept when he actually rented an RV and traveled with them. And some letters and some interviews, and that's it. So when I was asked about I guess 5 years ago now, to do something creative with these fragments that had been sitting in his archives for over 2 decades. I was really excited because, it was sort of mystical. Henri's unpublished trapeze manuscript, it was sort of, everyone wanted to know what it was. And it was quite disappointing because there wasn't actually as much as I thought there was going to be. But it became really clear to me fast that while I don't know what his book would have been, I don't think he knew what his book was going to become, so I couldn't write the book he would have written, that I could tell this great story, that there was this superly fascinating story about this middle-aged Dutch priest who lives with people with disabilities who falls in love with a traveling trapeze troupe and discovers all sorts of things and really struggles to figure out what it means to him. And it's just a great story. So the book's in 2 voices. I leave Henri's writings quite intact, and that's in one typeface, and then I frame it. So my writing is also in a separate typeface. So you can really tell what's me and what's Henri. And it reads like a novel. It's just like Henri hoped it would.
It's kind of a book within a book, because we're excited with Henri. We're feeling the things that Henri is feeling. And part of the question that we're all wondering is like, what's the book? What's the book that you're going to show us? And why haven't you written it? And what's stopping you from writing it? Or what do you want it to say? And at the same time, we're meeting Henri himself, which is, of course, not the book Henri would have written. But we kind of get to have both books, Henri's book of his excitement, and then also that we're kind of watching Henri experience this all over again. I don't really even know how to categorize the book. It's kind of a biography. It's kind of spiritual. It's kind of secular. It's kind of like a novel. It's kind of like nonfiction, and it almost kind of brings all the pieces that Henri was trying to hold together. It brings them all together and almost lets us kind of put them together on our own, and figure out what that might have been, which I think is what Henri was trying to do with his novel in the first place.
Well, he was really trying to get the hang of a story that's open-ended so that people would find in it what God wanted them to find. He says great spiritual masters wrote stories. Jesus spoke in parables. Why am I so afraid to try to just tell an open-ended story and let people discover it for themselves? Yeah.
As you approached kind of this task, how did you balance trying to write the book Henri would have wanted to write with writing the book about Henri and his desire to write this book?
Well, it certainly helped that I knew Henri, that I knew him quite well. So I had a feel for who he was. And we talked. He actually talked a lot about the trapeze, and I was never interested. Like I say at the beginning of the book, I don't like heights. It didn't grab me as an image at all. So as I started to work on this book, I had to actually get what he was after, and it really grabbed me. Once I started to get on the inside of what he was seeing, once we develop a relationship with God, we discover our internal spiritual life, but then what are we going to do about that in the world? What are we going to do together? Once we're kind of mature and we're adults and equals, not fathers and sons or mothers and daughters, or once we aren't in some kind of hierarchy with each other, what great act are we going to do together in the world? And what he discovered was that they had so much fun doing it, the kindness they had to have for each other, the discipline that they needed to forgive each other, because people mess up, and you've got to forgive each other and get ready for the next act without carrying resentment and assuming that you'll do your best the next time. Like, there's so much in it about how we live together kindly and mercifully and with a whole lot of energy. And he just keeps talking about how much fun they're having, which I think is a great image for our spiritual lives. I mean, even your image of the pillar of fire, I mean, one could think of it as dragging yourself through the desert complaining about the manna, right? But Henri's image is that following that pillar of fire is really fun. It's an adventure. It will take you places you never thought of.
Yeah, I really do like his descriptions of the trapeze. It's like this childlike wonder,
Yeah, Yeah.
Because, growing up, we went to the circus once in a while in Denver, like the big circus would come through and we'd have the trapeze artist would be there, and then they do the little set without the net, and it was fascinated me. But I'm close enough to the age of the internet that there's so much input right now that something is amazing as trapeze work. It doesn't really I don't really think of it as like, wow, that's amazing. But I love him, like how it's like a reframing of it for me. It's kind of nice.
Yeah, and he's just so riveted by it. It just is everything he wants to be, just flying that freedom.
I kind of wonder, we're at a disadvantage not having read a lot of Henri Nouwen, so it's interesting to meet Henri in this book first. I get the sense from maybe between the lines that Henri was a little bit comical all the time with his, maybe clumsiness or, leaving the stove on that maybe at daybreak you knew, and that the Rodleighs, the trapeze troupe, got to also experience. So you have the shared, fondness about his clumsiness. But I also would have thought of Henri as the very cerebral, intelligent person. Was he a different? Are we meeting a different Henri? Was he free to be a different version of himself when he was with this trapeze group, or was that just the Henri that just was always like that, and it just came to this perfect analogy and community in this trapeze group?
Yeah, well, there have been several biographies of Henri written since his death, and people really do tend to emphasize a very painful side of Henri that is part of why people love his writing so much, because they can relate to it, because he is so honest about his loneliness, about his desire to manipulate people. He's so self-revealing about how hard it is to be human, and about his own struggles. But he also could laugh at himself. He had a very funny sense of humor about himself, about other people. And so the book starts out with Rodleigh, the trapeze artist, at Henri's funeral. And one of the people speaking at the funeral is talking about Henri's anguish and his insecurities and his loneliness. And Rodleigh, this is one of the things that helped shape the book for me, because Rodleigh's still around. And Rodleigh said, I just had to hold myself back. I wanted to run up and interrupt him and say, that's not the Henri we knew. And so your question's really good. There was something about hanging out with this trapeze troupe that was really liberating for him. I think the messiness of the circus life spoke to him about, just not having to be perfect, about not getting it right all the time, of being able to fall. There's a really nice point when he first, I think it's like the second performance he ever goes to, and one of the trapeze artists falls, and he watches, she just jumps out of the net, she climbs up the ladder, she carries on. She's fine with it, but Henri says he can hardly stand it. He's just in agony, just thinking about, the humiliation, the frustration, the embarrassment of having to do this in front of all these people. And one of the great things about Henri is he sets all that out so clearly, his own discomfort watching her, and it's not her discomfort, it's his.
Another thing that I identified with Henri is, again, maybe his judgment of himself that's very, very harsh. And then even the weight of the judgment of other people that follows him around constantly. But as he's introduced to this troupe, it seems like he starts to learn not only to see their acceptance of that imperfection, but kind of that seems to bleed into, I don't know, maybe even his own thinking about himself. And there's this beautiful scene, and our audience in our show, we talk a lot about these in-between places, the borders between being in a church and not being in a church, or being religious or secular, or, even at daybreak, the boundary between being disabled and not. And Henri has this experience where he walks into a church after having spent the day at the circus and realizes he misses the spiritual community back at the circus. and he's watching, maybe a dry performance in the church building, and he's exploring these overlapping spaces where, from the outside it would seem this isn't a spiritual place or this isn't a religious place, but he can't help but see that even when maybe the Rodleighs can't.
Yeah, and he's kind of relieved to get back to the messy, muddy circus grounds.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
instead of what probably, would normally be this beautiful thing. And I feel like a lot of the book is this Henri discovering that overlap, or was that part of Henri's lived experience his whole life? These, being an insider and an outsider, being kind of strange within his own body or within his own community, but also very much accepted and in those places.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good way to put it. Yeah, that he was always sort of searching for a deeper sense of home, and in his own body, in his community, knowing where he was safe, knowing where he was loved, feeling accepted and able to really relax and be fun. And we saw that at Daybreak. Daybreak also really liberated that for him. Hanging around, we had 3 small children. He would come over and he just wanted to see the world through everybody's eyes. He wanted to be on the inside of what other people were living. So he would come over and he would crawl around on the floor and look under the table and under the sofa to see what were our kids looking at. He really, really sincerely wanted to see the world through everybody's eyes.
I feel like that Henri's body, again, not having read much of Henri Nouwen, Henri's body is a huge character in this book, both using up all the bathwater, but also his own relationship with his own body, or learning his own body in a couple of comical scenes. How did Daybreak change Henri's perception of kind of his embodied existence, and how did the Rodleighs and the trapeze and the circus form his ideas about himself and about people, humans here on this planet?
Yeah, I think L'Arche, as you were saying earlier, it really put him face to face with the fact that he was very comfortable preaching the word, being a person of the word, and that being in a community that was really founded on embodiment, the incarnation, on being physical together, was very uncomfortable for him for a long time. In fact, he had a fairly major emotional break, and did 6 months of intense therapy trying to figure out what was so painful about his disconnection from his own body, and why he was so needy and stuck. And one of the things that helped him was actually his friend Adam, who was a guy who had quite a lot of seizures. He never spoke a word in his 33-year life. He needed complete care. And Henri, of course, was terrified, coming from being a professor, to try to give physical help to Adam. But he started to learn from Adam that Adam had nothing to prove, he had nothing to hide. He was just very comfortable in his own body, and it challenged Henri to think, why am I so uncomfortable in my body? What if I could learn something from Adam here? And that actually was really important to him. Over his time at Daybreak, he learned how to hug people. He learned how to relax. He learned he started to dance more. There was something about his physical life at Daybreak that was very freeing for him. And then the trapeze, I think, was the next step of that. To watch these bodies just flying through the air. Just letting go of everything, flying this great distance through the air, being caught, being trusting, sometimes falling, but then getting up and trying again. There was just something about that he said university had been the life of the mind, and L'Arche really taught him about the life of the heart, but the trapeze just embodied something about that the body tells a spiritual story that he wanted to write about.
I know spring is coming, but I need you right now. I know soon the sun will break through and I'll feel your light.
Throughout the book, Henri is is trying to communicate this spiritual truth or truths that he's learned, like inside his body. Now it's bodied and not in words, and he's trying to get it back into words, and excited and fearful. And there are these ideas that I connect to, and this is what drew me to the book in the first place. This idea of, Henri said that the trapeze is theology in motion, and that there was so much to learn in watching these acts, but especially about this idea of the risks, taking the risks, being fine if you're going to fall, but also trusting the catcher. So there's you kind of learn about the trapeze, but there's people swinging all over the place, leaping about, and then all of this coordinated action comes together, and it's somebody's job to take this person who's flying through the air. That person has to just completely trust that they're going to extend their arms out, and it's somebody's job to grab those arms and bring them to safety.
Yeah, and that was a huge thing for Henri when Rodleigh himself explained that as the flyer, that he couldn't grab the catcher. That if he tried to readjust his grip to reach for the catcher first, then they could actually break their wrists. So the flyer actually just puts their arms out and waits, and the catcher swings up and grabs them. And then they, then the flyer grabs them back, kind of forearm to forearm, But the flyer can't catch the catcher. And for Henri, that was a huge spiritual metaphor of we just fly, and in the end we trust we'll be caught, that we trust the catcher. And not just for our deaths, but in our lives too. That we trust each other, that we entrust ourselves to each other, that we try to catch each other, and that we'll fall sometimes, but we'll try again.
That's a beautiful, that's beautiful imagery. And it makes sense to me that, now that we're kind of talking this through a little bit, how or why Henri would be so fascinated by trapeze work, because feeling so uncomfortable in his own body, seeing people who are so confident with what they're doing, and yet in danger all the time, but yet there's someone there to catch them, and if there's a problem, they can get up and go again. And just I can see that that would really speak to someone who was someone like Henri was.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating how that all those things connect.
Yeah, and this whole question of being an outsider and an insider at the same time. He loved going into worlds knowing that he would be an outsider. He was an outsider in the circus. He was an outsider when he went to march with Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Birmingham, but Martin Luther King Jr. had called for church leaders to come, and he responded. And it was incredibly significant for him to learn about community and to be with people that way. He went with great fear to speak to people in HIV/AIDS ministry. He kept putting himself in situations that felt a bit scary to him. But I mean, again, it's your theme, right? You just follow that pillar of fire where it leads, and you trust that where you're going will turn out okay eventually.
Yeah, trust is hard.
And don't light the fires yourselves. I think that's the thing that I struggle with in everyday life, is the more that I'm stressed out, or I have a longing that I need, the more I want to grab, catch, provide my own sense of security or my own sense of control and grab on tighter. And it's so counterintuitive to me to let go of those things and trust that it's going to be okay, that I don't need to be the catcher, that it's okay to be the flyer or even the faller.
Yeah, the other thing about a catcher is that it's not the end of the act usually. Like the catcher catches the flyer and then they don't just stop midair, right? They're still in momentum. So the catcher catches the flyer and then they send them on to do another trick, or they send them back to the pedestal to join someone else. And I just, in so many ways, I find it such a fascinating image for our spiritual lives, for our lives with each other.
Yeah.
So Henri, who's a great writer, is struggling to put these words down openly and publicly, and in his journals, struggling to figure out. There's this fear, and there's an excitement, and part of the book I think is just exploring What was that excitement? What was that fear? And I've thought about this a lot because I think humans have this tendency to think that I'm always going to be the person I am now. I'm not going to change, but then we look back 20 years and we think it's silly that we were that person, but we think that we're going to be this person forever. And it seems like Henri was doing the same thing. That he had these new thoughts, feelings, emotions, passions, right? And he had all of these roles that he had become known as a priest, a scholar, advocate for the disabled, whatever it was. Each of those became an expectation that maybe wasn't always what he was going to do next. Do you have any sense, in what Henri encountered here seemed to be so powerful and magnetic and electric and spiritual and secular? Who do you think he would have wanted to show these things to? Who do you think he was writing this book to? Who did he want to see this and, make the perfect package? Probably why he didn't write it. Who was he trying to get this in front of?
One of the really poignant things he says that you probably read was just that he realizes he's, by the time he writes this, he's in his, 63, 64 years old. And he says that he becomes more and more aware that Jesus died when he was 33. And he wonders, who would Jesus have become? Like how would he have lived his life if he'd had 3 more decades?
Mm.
And so he wonders, is he like how Henri wonders for himself, how will he keep developing? And what he wanted to do was he really wanted this trapeze image to speak about the spiritual life to people who weren't in church, who weren't religious in a conventional way. I mean, he wanted to speak to his more usual audience too, but he also was just hoping that maybe this story would speak and help with the spiritual hunger that he saw everywhere. He just saw so much kind of longing among people for a deeper meaning, for a deeper sense of community, for a braver way to live in the world. There's actually a real sweet point when he's, again, speaking of your pillar of fire, but he's driving his camper. Remember, he's driving this camper van at night down small roads, and he's terrified. He hates driving. He's never driven anything so big. It's dark. He's scared to death. And he's trying to figure out what is the point as he, with white knuckles and terror, drives this camper van. And he says, well, what is this all about? 5 people, 4 huge mobile homes, moving from one little German town to the next, sometimes in rain, sometimes in very cold weather, with never an excuse to stop for a while, to not perform, to not feel up for it. And all for a 10-minute act that most people forget after they've seen it. Well, it's the entertainer's life, making people say ooh and ah and wow and no. Making them feel tension and release, making them look up to the dome of the tent and say, how can they do it? I can't believe it. And sending them home with that strange but quickly passing sensation of having been in another world. Is my own life very different, he asks. I travel here and there giving talks, make people feel safe or excited, and help them come to terms with their feelings of loss, failure, and anguish, as well as their feelings of growth, success, and joy. Am I like circus people, an entertainer? Do I try to hold people up between the many fragmented moments of their lives and give them a glimpse of the beyond? Well, what's wrong with being an entertainer? Isn't Jesus the greatest of all entertainers? Isn't he holding people up in a life that constantly wants to go flat? Helping people look up for a moment and realize that there's more to life than they might have thought. And I think that's what he wanted the book to do. But he didn't want to write, 10 spiritual lessons about the trapeze. He didn't want to set it out there. He wanted to tell a story that people would have the fun of interpreting it and figuring it out for themselves.
I think the book, The 10 Spiritual Principles of the Trapeze, would have been fantastic by Henri Nouwen. Would have been so good. I think that Henri realized it would have been, his formulaic, the thing he did over and over that he was good at, but he himself wasn't learning the lesson of the trapeze, right? He was staying well within his lane and what he knew best. But when you have the 10 spiritual principles, or the 3 ways to learn from trapeze artists, you limit the experience and you limit the metaphor. You don't let it live on its own and have its depth, which is probably why people
maybe you limit the spirit too. Maybe you trust God to reveal things that you haven't thought of yet. If you can just give people an experience, then they get to go deeper themselves. And it leaves an awful lot more room, I think, for God, to do something new.
Such an interesting point, because I want to put boxes around things and lists and categorize things, but Jesus is the storyteller who just gives us the story and then for the most part leaves us to it.
Yeah.
Occasionally whispering to someone, "No, you didn't get it. This is what I was trying to say," but often just leaving the story to continue to have depth throughout, decades and centuries.
It stays with the reader more when you have to, like, you become part of it. You're trying to figure out what it means, and then it can mean more things to more different people in deeper ways than if you just said, "This is this and this is that."
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what Henry, to go back to your question, that's the audience he wanted, was people who wanted to listen to the story and think about it themselves and discover layers of meaning in it as he had, but not just what he discovered, to find their own meanings and fun.
I think it's interesting that, people like me who get to meet Henry first this way, it's again this overlapping in between place. The Henry with the story of the trapeze. I'm interested to know what surprises I'm going to find when I meet Henry in his other work. I also wonder, for people who are familiar with his body of work and then meet this Henry, what surprises are in store for them, and what again in these in between places you kind of get to go both directions. That's one of the things I love about a secular book with spiritual truth, or a spiritual book with secular realism.
Yeah, and thinking about your again, I just really like this following the fire theme. You can tell it really works for me. It really fascinates me, because Henry, and actually my life too, if you think about mine, just you keep following all these new directions, and it's like Jesus and John, when those early disciples start to follow him around, and he says, "What do you want?" and they say, "Where do you live?" and he says, "Come and see." And in a way, Henry's life is just a whole series of responding to that, of come and see, of going to different places. And I don't know if you remember, but there was something really, he speaks really beautifully at the National Catholic HIV/AIDS Network Conference about how his sense of smallness or boundaries are being blown wide open. And I don't know. Can I read more Henry, or?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just find it fun to read Henry's. He says, so he's speaking to several thousand people, and he says, and first you have to know, he said okay that he would go to the conference, then he got scared and he said he wouldn't, and then he said yes, and then he said no. So
I have to interject, because these conferences weren't in 2021; they were in 1995, which seems both like yesterday, but also a long time ago, when this was a community that was there was a lot of fear just about this pandemic going on, a lot of fear about this community and what does it mean for I don't know, religious people or whatever. So that,
and there was no cure. It was before antiretrovirals. Like it was the leading cause of death among all people aged 25 to 44 in the U.S. It was a huge, terrifying. Yeah, it's good to put us back into that moment when Henry says, "Yeah, I'll come speak to you." Yep.
Yeah.
And he says, being in this conference has been a little bit like a new jump into something unknown, a little bit frighteningly unknown, and not knowing what it will do to me. Maybe my whole life has been a life in which boundaries are pushed out and broken down, and it has been frightening for me every time a new boundary came tumbling down. So I've realized, okay, I might have started in community or in the church or in the seminary or in my family as a safe, clear place. And then bang, 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 all these boundaries keep falling. All these little hedges and fences keep falling away. Suddenly, the non-believer might be more believing than the believer. The outsider might have something to teach the insider. Suddenly, the difference between Catholic and Protestant, Christian and Buddhist, religious and secular, aren't the kind of difference I thought it was. When I went to Daybreak, my community now, I realized that the difference between handicapped and non-handicapped just wasn't there anymore. The difference between male and female, young and old, married and celibate, white and persons of color, all the distinctions that seemed so important. Suddenly the AIDS pandemic throws all these differences away. The difference between homosexual and asexual and bisexual people, or between married people and transgender people. And he says, I've never heard so many terms, and his audience just starts to laugh. And then he says this great thing. He says, it seems that these differences aren't that important, actually. Married, celibate, single, you can be anything, but we are together. The AIDS pandemic brings us together. I tell you that for me personally, and I would guess in some places for you, that when the boundaries are falling away, you get anxious sometimes and say, now where do I say stop? Or here? Is this it? And it's no longer there, and suddenly you realize that your heart is expanding and there are no boundaries to that expansion.
That's really cool. I like that a lot.
That's such a... I almost want to tear up at that. Just I feel like this connects to Jesus, and when there was the boundary between the most holy place and then where women could go, and then where non-Jewish people could go, right? And then every time a boundary fell down, people thought, you must be doing something wrong. The boundaries are also our security blankets.
Yeah.
And our definitions of in and out, or good and bad, or whatever it is. And starting to realize maybe that this love thing, it doesn't have a boundary, is terrifying, but then also exhilarating, kind of I feel like that's a theme that we talk about a lot. Just like, where can we draw the line? Where can I draw a line to just finally say, well, that's a line too far. But
I love the names that you can get anxious, trying to figure out positioning yourself. And I also love that he says that not that the differences don't matter entirely, but they're not what he thought they were. And, like racial differences matter. We're living in a different, it is a different thing to be gendered differently, to be racially, diverse. Like people live different realities. So he's not discounting difference, but he's saying the differences don't mean what I thought they did. They aren't about who's in and who's out. They don't have to do with who I can love or accept or not. It's not about that. He was very interested in differences and, how we were living different realities. He was he was so fascinated by human experience. But I just love that suddenly you realize that your heart is expanding and there are no boundaries to that expansion.
And I love that curiosity. And I think that the lack of curiosity is what we seem to be struggling with so much now in society. Because if I look at you and you're different, whatever that is, race, gender, whatever, and all I think about is I see that you're different, then I'm absolutely immediately putting up a wall. When you're curious, like he was, like even like the story about your kids, like looking underneath the couch,
Yeah.
When you're that curious about people around you, they become people. They become something to love, not something to look at and analyze, but someone to empathize with and to get inside their heart and figure out what drives them. And I think that's to me that's a beautiful way to just learn to love each other and love people the way Jesus loved people.
I think it's probably come out in my enthusiasm, but I really think Henri succeeded in writing his book. It was just an exhilarating journey for me. I felt like I was feeling those things along with him, and then I couldn't stop thinking about my life and my spirituality and my enemies and my friends and my fears and the things that I'm holding on to. So I'm so grateful for Henri and his life and his work. I think you succeeded in writing his book as well, and I feel lucky to have gotten to, almost by accident, meet this character and then all of the people along the way, so that I can kind of learn these. It's so funny, learn these lessons that somebody learned 25 years ago that now I need to learn, just by following those same steps, or maybe getting infected by some of that curiosity. So I want to say thank you to Henri and thank you to you for putting this kind of journey of a book together. I'm so glad it wasn't the 3 spiritual truths about the circus.
Well, nice to meet you guys. Nice too. I love talking about the book, and I love talking about Henri. Thanks for inviting me to do that. On the back cover, you'll see this great picture of Henri lying in the arms of the trapeze troupe, looking absolutely elated and absolutely awkward in his body and absolutely in his happy place all at once. It's so great.
That's awesome.
It's so great.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk with us about it. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Good to meet you guys.
Do you have any other projects going on or writings that you're working on? Anything like that?
Not for sure yet. There's a couple things kind of percolating a bit, but first it's just really fun to get this book launched, to send it out into the world. It's a little like sending your kids out, you sort of, it's time for it to leave the nest and, I'm kind of done and I just send it out and I hope it has a really happy life and I'm really interested in how it does. And I hope it develops lots of intimate relationships that I don't need to know everything about. And I just hope that it has a really good life out there.
That's so funny. I really, really enjoyed it. I hope I can infect a few other people with that journey. And we, as straight-laced, in our denomination, it's so, the circus is the opposite of, you know what I mean? With noises and music and, flamboyant dresses and, it's so fun to find the spirituality in those places and not always in the stiff spots. So.
Hey, thanks for listening. We hope you got something out of the episode today. Check the show notes in your podcast app for all the links and references that were made, or you can find it all at followingthefire.com. If you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/followingthefire to become a patron. And of course, we'd love it if you rate the podcast and share it with others. See you later.
And I'll give you all my heart. Don't you know it's all I have? Even on my heart can't compare with what you're worth. I have been running almost all my life, but you always chase me down.